go.
Welcome to NYCBD with Jeffrey Hill on 710 WOR.
Welcome. I'm Jeffrey Hill, your host, right here on 710 WOR Radio in New York City. On the other side of the glass, and for those of you who are now watching on YouTube, there is no glass.
I told you this already.
I know you told me, but I like making it up. Listen, when I was growing up, it was always on the other side of the glass, my friend.
Fine.
So as of now, you're on the other side of the invisible glass. Anyway, that's the flips. Do we have him on the camera? Okay, show his pretty face, because when his mom and dad watches the show.
Wants to see
No,
that.
of course they do, brother man. Everybody, you're famous now. Come on, you're on the show. You're a big dog. Okay, so briefly, flips, wearing the Yankee hat, of course, not the Giants hat. Patriots 43, Miami nothing. Thoughts, please?
I don't care about the Patriots, but...
All right, let's go to the Giants. How'd the Giants do?
We're going to start Daniel Jones, so we'll see.
Okay, well, that means they lost again. That's what that means.
That is what that means.
All right, my young brother, can we move on with the show, please?
Yes, come on.
All right, let's do that. We have a lot of people in the studio today, so let's keep it moving. All right. First, let's tell the folks how they can find us. We're available right here every Sunday morning at 8 a.m. on 710 WOR Radio in New York City. Then the show becomes available as a podcast on the iHeartRadio app and iTunes. Just search NYCBD with Jeffrey Hill. The show is also on Instagram at NYCBD Official and on Twitter and Facebook. It's an amazing thing, isn't it, Flips? When I come in 19 weeks ago, I'm not even sure I knew how to get on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. And today, I literally have all these things supporting the show. It's very exciting.
It took a few times for me to explain it to you.
Yeah, I know it did. But, anybody under 25 is an expert in all this stuff. And if you're under 10, you're brilliant. We're also shooting the show live. And, of course, you've seen this, hopefully. We have a YouTube channel, also called NYCBD, but you got to add a space this time, official. Don't forget the space. We're excited to have a number of people in the studio with us today. I've mentioned Jimmy Cozier countless times. Guess what? He finally showed up. Yes, he is here. He's written for Mary J. Blige, Janet Jackson, Sinead O'Connor, just to name a few. His video team is also here. We've got Devin and Tim. We're thrilled to have them. And we're going to talk to you in a minute about a couple of our guests that we've got. Also in the studio is an old friend of ours who's off screen, apparently, Tripp Keber. Tripp Keber's been on the show a couple of times. For those of you who know Tripp, and you've listened to the show before, you know not miking up Tripp is a dangerous thing. So if you guys hear some screaming and yelling during the show, you'll know that Tripp wants to get on the show. Thank you, Tripp. All right, also in the studio is Jonathan Summers, a very interesting and well-respected investor and operator in the space, and I will introduce him shortly. All right, based on your very favorable comments, we're sticking with our 4 segments until further notice. Our first segment is called Cannabis in the Tri-State +1. As said on previous shows, about 65% of our listenership hail from New York City, or New York, Connecticut, and New Jersey. That's the tri-state around here. As do I, of course. Our +1 is Massachusetts, an homage to my dad. Our second segment is called Stunning and Amazing Facts, what I consider to be some of the most relevant issues and opportunities in the space today. Each fact is called a...
Stunner.
Exactly right. Look at him go. He's actually learning the show. It's astounding. I will attempt to educate and perhaps even stun you just a bit. For our third segment, today's guest, it is my honor to bring Jonathan Summers on the show. CEO and Vice Chairman of EXMCeuticals, who began his career in London, working for Goldman Sachs for about 15 years. EXM is a wholesale medicinal and nutraceutical cannabis company who intends to become the largest volume, lowest cost producer of cannabidiol in the world. Incredible claim. They're also doing business in Africa, Portugal, Canada, and many other countries with the goal of producing quality product at the lowest possible price. Lastly, we will end with our fourth segment called Your Messages, providing answers to the most interesting direct messages we received following last week's show. We'll be back to begin our first segment, Cannabis in the Tri-State +1, right after this. Welcome back to NYCBD with Jeffrey Hill, right here on 710 WOR Radio. Also available as a podcast on iHeartRadio, iTunes, and through Instagram. Just search NYCBD Official. Well, let's begin our Cannabis in the Tri-State +1 segment with something that is affecting the entire category. Concerns over vaping product chemicals have exploded in recent weeks as health officials nationwide investigate the cause of mysterious and deadly lung illness afflicting people who reported vaping marijuana, nicotine, or both, in days or weeks before suffering life-threatening breathing problems. Health officials have urged people to stop vaping until they determine the cause. Let's go to New York. New York Governor Andrew Cuomo said this week he would subpoena 3 companies, including one based in Amherst, Mass, called Mass Terpenes. Why? For selling thickeners that contain nearly pure vitamin E oil for vape cartridge manufacturers. Mass Terpenes is an online business and was one of 3 companies nationwide hawking products shown in lab tests to be, quote, nearly pure vitamin E acetate oil, close quote. New York officials said that ingredient added to marijuana oil by illicit vape producers is among the possible chemicals suspected of causing lung problems. I recently sat in on a session with Liz Kruger, state assemblywoman from New York. She reiterated that Governor Cuomo and the State House are committed to making adult use happen, but the assembly simply, quote, I love this quote, ran out of time this year, close quote, and looks forward to continuing to debate the issue and seek closure. She reiterated that New York is anxious to make licenses available for small businesses of color, many of whom have been most affected by aggressive cannabis laws. If you heard my show last week, of the 1,400 or so people that have been arrested for cannabis-only offenses, in New York that is, they were either all black or brown. What percentage of the 1,400 were all black or brown? 100%. Good job, Flips.
I said most. You spoke over.
Okay, there you go. So the homage to the multicultural community certainly hasn't started yet, has it? No. All right. Well, adult use is getting broad interest in Albany. New York's governor seemed to suggest that he might want a ban on smoking marijuana included in legalization when lawmakers take up the issue again next year. During an interview with MSNBC, the governor was asked whether the spike in apparent vaping-related lung injuries and deaths will affect the go-no-go decision on legalization. His answer? No. He said, but his administration is, quote, not in favor of smoking marijuana, close quote, and that there are other ways to get THC without smoking it. People are vaping THC. Yes, that is true, Cuomo said. We think that from a public health point of view, this is not, repeat, not, something that we recommend. He didn't say repeat, by the way. I just repeated it on my own. And we think smoking of any kind is dangerous. You can legalize marijuana and sell THC in compounds that do not require you to smoke the marijuana, he said. By that, I assume he likely means what's called in the industry form factors, different delivery vehicles, different ways to get the stuff. So how about gummies? How about soft gels? How about tinctures? That can all deliver THC or CBD through hemp, right? Without smoking the product. All right, let's move on to Connecticut and New Jersey. Well, this will be a quick one. There's no real news in either state, so we'll just move on to Massachusetts. How'd you like that, Flipsy?
It's a good idea.
There you go. All right, moving quickly. State regulators reacting to growing alarm about the health risks of vaping endorsed a measure Thursday to require marijuana companies to disclose all ingredients in vape cartridges sold in licensed stores. The move by Massachusetts Cannabis Control Commission followed a Boston Globe report last week raising questions about regulatory gaps in the state's oversight of additives in regulated marijuana cartridges. What does that mean? Well, Massachusetts health officials are investigating 10 possible cases of lung problems related to vaping, but haven't confirmed any of them yet. This is something we've taken very seriously as a commission, Executive Director Sean Collins said, adding that the change is, quote, an attempt to disclose to patients or consumers what is actually in the product they may be procuring. Interesting. The commission voted unanimously to include the rule in its proposed regulatory changes that it will vote on later this month. All right, moving on. First, it was Paul Pierce. All you Massachusetts people know who Paul Pierce is. Flipsy, who's Paul Pierce?
Crappy basketball player on the Celtics.
Okay, very good. Okay, if you were born in Boston and you live anywhere near Celtics country, you would not call him that. Indeed, you would call him one of the greater basketball players of all time. All right, then it was Gronkowski. Now you can count on Mark Wahlberg as the latest local celebrity looking to cash in on the CBD craze in Massachusetts. On Monday, the alkaline water company announced that it had acquired Aqua Hydrate, an LA-based bottled water producer that counts Wahlberg among its backers. Good job, Mark. A press release announcing the acquisition made clear that the newly combined company planned to launch several CBD-infused products in the near future, quote, due to increased demand and popularity for functional wellness beverages, close quote. Finally, in Massachusetts, the state's system of local control of marijuana businesses, in which a single municipal official often decides the fate of a company, is ripe for abuse. A growing chorus of politicians said, following the arrest of Fall River's mayor, how do you like that, Fall River? You elected the mayor. He took $575,000 in money. We call that a shakedown where I come from. And, quote, maybe the state needs to put something in place that says it needs to actually be a governing entity, not a single person. Well, that was said by Governor Charlie Baker, who told the Globe that last week. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that covers the latest news in the Tri-State Plus One. We'll be back with our next segment, Stunning and Amazing Facts, right after this. Welcome back to NYCBD with Jeffrey Hill, right here on 710 WOR Radio, every Sunday at 8 a.m., and then available as a podcast on iHeartRadio and iTunes. You can also find us on all social sites at NYCBD Official. So let's begin this segment, Stunning and Amazing Facts, with new facts we believe are most relevant in the space. Stunner number one. What once was illegal, both at the federal and the state level, is now becoming, quote, must study, close quote. That was my quote, by the way. Science for some challenging disease states. A major U.S. university announced that it will be launching the nation's first center devoted exclusively to researching psychedelic drugs. What school is that? How about Johns Hopkins University? They said it received $17 million in private funding to make the facility possible. A team of 6 researchers and 5 postdoctoral scientists will conduct studies on a wide range of potential therapeutic uses of psychedelics, like psilocybin, which comes from mushrooms, including treatment of opioid addiction, Alzheimer's disease, depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder. The university has also already produced cutting-edge research into psychedelics. In fact, in 2000, Johns Hopkins researchers were the first in the U.S. to gain federal approval to initiate research into psychedelics. The institution has since published 60 peer-reviewed studies on the subject. The group's findings on both the promise and the risks of psilocybin helped create a path forward for its potential medical approval and reclassification from a Schedule I drug, the most restrictive federal government category, to a more appropriate level, the university said in a press release. Quote, psilocybin was classified as Schedule I during the Nixon administration. Who remembers that in here? Virtually no one. But research over the last decade has shown psilocybin to have low toxicity and abuse potential. Roland Griffiths, the center's director, said its establishment, quote, reflects a new era of research in therapeutics and the mind through studying this unique and remarkable class of pharmacological compounds. Flips, please. Say pharmacological compounds at least 3 times.
Not going to happen.
Come on. Give it to me once.
Not gonna, pharmacological compound.
There you go. Brilliantly done. Yep, man had 6 years of college. NYCD will have a show specifically devoted to psychedelics and additional thoughts on this topic within the next 4 weeks. All right, let's move on. Stunner number 2. Hemp farming quadrupled in the U.S. this year. The amount of land on which U.S. farmers are licensed to grow hemp has more than quadrupled this year. Flips, I'm not going to ask you what quadrupled means because you may get it wrong. That's according to a report released on Thursday by an advocacy group called Vote Hemp. Under the provisions of the 2014 Farm Bill, farmers have been able to grow crops for limited hemp research programs, but thanks to a new version of the large-scale agriculture legislation passed and signed into law last year, the plant is now officially legal under federal law as long as farmers comply with state rules. U.S. farmers have been licensed to grow, are you ready for this? 511,000 acres of marijuana's non-intoxicating cannabis cousin, that would be hemp, this year, a 455% increase over 2018 levels, according to Vote Hemp's annual survey of state agricultural departments. While this represents a short-term financial windfall in many ag states, the issue ultimately will be who will become the low-cost supplier of high-quality hemp. A topic we will be getting into very shortly with our guest, Jonathan Summers. All right, hold on to that thought, ladies and gentlemen. Stunt number 3. Federal prosecutors held a closed-door marijuana summit a few weeks ago. U.S. attorneys, federal regulators, cannabis businesses, and the nation's leading prohibitionist group convened for a behind-closed-doors marijuana summit. The invite-only event, hosted by Oregon's U.S. attorney, was held at the federal courthouse in Portland and featured, quote, short presentations, moderated discussions, and Q&A. Fascinating. It was the second summit of its kind, following up a similar event that the federal prosecutor Billy Williams held last year. That was largely seen as hostile to legalization, and which came about after then Attorney General Jeff Sessions, we all remember him, of course, rescinded Obama-era guidance on federal cannabis enforcement priorities. Governor Kate Brown, a Democrat, of course, spoke at the earlier event and said that federal officials assured her that legitimate marijuana businesses in the state are, quote, not targets of law enforcement. Well, interesting. Williams also serves as the head of Justice Department's Marijuana Working Group, which is tasked with studying the impact of cannabis legalization. He has been critical of Oregon's marijuana program, arguing that illegal diversion is rampant, and I can tell you firsthand that's true. What diversion means is you buy it in Oregon and it goes all over the place, right? The goal of this gathering was to provide a sharing of perspectives on the current state of marijuana. U.S. attorneys from California, Washington, Florida, Colorado, and Vermont all spoke. Also appearing was Mike Stewart, the federal prosecutor from the Southern District of West Virginia, who has regularly expressed hostility to cannabis reform and held a separate marijuana symposium last year that followed a similar theme. After the prosecutor's panel, representatives of the Food and Drug Administration, U.S. Department of Agriculture, Oregon Department of Agriculture, and the cannabis company, Oregon CBD, discussed the current and future landscape of hemp and CBD at the national level. During another panel, an official from the International Association of Chiefs of Police, this is critically important, ladies and gentlemen, the U.S. Deputy Surgeon General and a cannabis education coordinator from Colorado Health Department talked about the risks associated with underage use and driving while impaired. We've had that conversation several times on this show, and it'll be a continuing discussion going forward. All right, moving on. Stunner number 4. Oh, yes. Senator Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican of Kentucky, is moving to insert language into a congressional spending report that calls on the FDA to clear a path for lawful marketing of hemp-derived CBD products. Interesting. Why do you think he does that, everyone? Well, could it be that Kentucky, which he represents, is the largest hemp growers in the United States? That seems to make sense. FDA has said that allowing CBD to be sold as food items or dietary supplements would require it to develop alternative regulations that could take years to complete. Without congressional action. But McConnell, of course, can generate that congressional action. He's the chief proponent of hemp legalization provision in the 2018 Farm Bill. He isn't interested in waiting around. He wants it done now. In draft language shared by the U.S. Hemp Roundtable, the senator is asking FDA to, quote, issue a policy of enforcement discretion with regard to certain products containing CBD within 120 days, close quote. A move that industry stakeholders say will clarify rules so that banks are more willing to service CBD companies. That's fascinating, isn't it, ladies and gentlemen, right? When Mitch wants to get something done, it gets done. Okay, there you go for the most important, stunning, and amazing facts affecting this category. When we come back, it will be my pleasure to welcome our guest, Jonathan Summers. 16 years at Goldman Sachs as an executive and managing director in London, and now chairman of EXMCeuticals, a cannabis firm doing business, as I said earlier, in Africa, Portugal, Canada, and other international geographies. We will be back right after this. Welcome back to NYCBD with Jeffrey Hill, right here on 710 WOR Radio. After airing every Sunday at 8 a.m., the show moves as a podcast to iHeartRadio and iTunes. We're also available on all social sites, including YouTube at NYCBD Official. All right. We have a very special treat in store for all of you, Jonathan Summers. Mr. Summers is an active investor who has a passion for helping young businesses grow and investing in startups. Jonathan joined EXM in the spring of 2019 as the chairman, having first come across the company during an earlier funding round. Prior to EXM, he was a founding partner of a $600 million London-based investment firm. Before this, Jonathan was a founding principal and head of business development for Myriad Asset Management, a $5 billion Hong Kong-based asset management firm. Prior to that, for 16 years, Jonathan was a managing director at Goldman Sachs in London, responsible for leading their equity capital markets franchise. Welcome, Jonathan. Good to have you with us.
Thank you, Jeffrey. I'm excited and flattered to be here with you today.
Well, we are excited to have you as well. And everybody in my audience just got excited because that accent will increase ratings 20%. So we appreciate that. By the way, that's natural for those of you who are confused. All right. So tell us a little bit about your investment advisory background and how did you get into cannabis?
Well, Jeffrey, I got into cannabis very recently and pretty much completely by chance and good fortune. And as you've already explained, it's the first time I've ever been involved professionally in something outside of finance. I'm English. I was born and I grew up there. As you said, I was a Wall Street investment banker for many years until 2011. Since then, I've been running, growing, and participating in asset management businesses. And over the last 2 years, I've done a lot of investing also in startup companies, mainly private ones, primarily tech and blockchain. And that was increasingly taking up a lot of my time over the last couple of years. About 4 or 5 months ago, I, as you said, was introduced to EXM as part of a funding round. I spent a lot of time looking at the company. I was, I'll be honest, very skeptical initially because cannabis wasn't an industry I knew anything about. There's a lot of business plans flying around in the cannabis space, the vast majority of which I think shouldn't be funded. But I spent a lot of time looking at the company and met everybody involved and did all of my due diligence. As part of that process, I actually got very, very excited about the company. And I thought that the plan they had really made sense. And I thought the way they were approaching it was something which it would be exciting to be part of. In a very sort of investment bankery way, I then made...
and that is a very special and unique way to do things.
I ask a lot of direct questions and maybe made a little bit of a pain in the ass of myself. And they then asked me if I wanted to get involved in an executive capacity and run the company. It took me about 5 minutes to think about it.
Very exciting.
It wasn't something that I felt like I needed to spend a week debating. I was at the point, and I still have never been as excited about any business I've been involved in my life. I'm completely committed to getting this to work. And I think it's something which I really want to tell people exactly what we're trying to do. Okay.
Well, I'm glad you do, because my next question says, if you would please tell us about EXM and what, give us a sense for what the company's vision and mission is. And let me follow up, if you would, please. So give us the headline, because I want the audience to really understand what you guys do, and then I'll follow up with some follow-up questions.
Of course. So the company started about 3 years ago, so long before I got involved. The company is listed in Canada. The ticker is EXM. We're also listed in Germany and soon to be listed here in the USA. The company is on the verge of big things, but remains little known, hence why I'm excited to be here. High level, we are not a recreational cannabis business. We are focused on CBD. We are focused on cannabinoids as an ingredient for consumer products. We are going to be growing cannabis for what we think will be extremely competitive prices in emerging markets in Africa. We will be refining this into extremely pure ingredients and cannabinoids. And then we also have an initiative to create products, which we can talk about later in this piece.
All right. That sounds great. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, I've been in the consumer packaged goods and healthcare business for all 42 years of my career. It's hard to believe, 42 years. There's people in this room that, they're not even 42. And neither are their mom and dad, for that matter, which is a little astounding. All right. So the controlling dynamic is many things, right? A product-based point of difference that addresses consumer needs, mandatory, clearly, right? A management team that has got nothing but quality people, mandatory, right? A good marketing effort to get the message out and to create loyalty among consumers, mandatory. What's next? Low-cost supplier. Why? Because when the market, which always does, in any category, moves from many players to fewer, right? There's a commoditization that takes place, certainly in a category that is ag-based like this one is, right? And when the commoditization takes place, who survives? The players that have the strongest, kind of metabolism do, and also those that have figured out low-cost supply. So as we get into this a little bit deeper with Jonathan, he's going to explain why doing business in what many of you people might consider, semi-third world countries can help you achieve a fundamental objective of low-cost supplier. So let's get into that in a little bit more depth. You're doing business, you mentioned, in Africa, Portugal, Canada, and soon to be the U.S., or perhaps even already in the U.S. Mm-hmm. It sounds incredibly challenging. How can you successfully execute across 3 continents with so many different governments and cannabis laws?
I agree.
So I guess the answer is it's going to be damn difficult. Go ahead.
Yes, I agree with you. It's going to be a challenge. We have a lot to do. You wouldn't have a chance to be able to execute all this without some great people. And again, we can talk a little bit about that later. You need great people who work hard. You're not going to be getting 8 hours of sleep a night. You also need some good lawyers because, as you say, the rules are changing and evolving, and you need to know what the rules are in different locations and different geographies. It is a lot of work. The other thing you have to do is you have to break it down into immediate deliverables, figure out what the next steps are to achieve, and just break it down and sequence it. And also you need the right partners. The business will grow and evolve, and as we grow and evolve as a business, we'll need new partners, employees, and expertise.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, respectfully, that answer applies to many companies,
Absolutely.
right? Okay. Yeah. So, as we get into this a little bit deeper, let's compare and contrast for a minute, right? So, the cultivation leaders literally in the globe today probably are housed in Canada, right? All 5, 6, 7 major LPs up there. They are indoor grows dominated by a climate which is fundamentally cold, right?
Correct,
so,
yes.
An ag business in Canada growing plants is challenging. Of course, if you bring it indoors, you can totally control it. However, you're talking about doing business in Africa, in other locations, right? There's a lot of conversation about Colombia as well, separate from this discussion, right? Those are markets that are closer to the equator, if you will, which have natural growing climates. All right. So what do the numbers look like in your enterprise versus this increasingly global legal producers who have what appears to be a much higher cost supply chain?
So various studies have been done on this, and it's approximately 80% cheaper to grow cannabis outdoors in emerging markets where it grows naturally than it is to grow it in greenhouses in developed markets. I think if you want to break this down into exactly why that's the case, cannabis is a natural plant, it's a weed, etc. It grows outdoors in certain regions of the globe very, very well. The plants reach very, very 9 feet tall. You're not building greenhouses. You're not building greenhouses that you have to heat. The plants get bigger. Most importantly, you can grow all year round outside of the rainy season. So this means you can pull in 3 crops. I appreciate there are people building cultivation businesses in other jurisdictions. There, you might get 1 to 2. So you certainly don't get the number of crops. Africa has a lot of long, sunny days. The plant grows well outdoors. All of this adds up to just being able to produce more product for less money.
I got it. So let me just give a little bit of education to the listening audience, right? So think about what he's saying. When he says crops, he's talking about harvests, right? So an indoor grow, somewhere between 5 and 7 harvests. The plants are being grown out to 3 or 4 feet. Now, that's an argument, right? Everybody argues because it's a philosophy. It's a science. Do I grow it to 4 feet and have fewer harvests a year? Or do I grow it to 3 feet and have more harvests, right? But it's all indoors. And when you talk to indoor growers, one of the key things they start to talk about is electrical costs and other fundamental dynamics to keep that place heated, right? And all the appropriate sunshine requirements or lights that are necessary in an indoor environment, right? Now compare that to what Jonathan is describing. He's talking about getting 3 harvests. He's talking about growing plants to a much bigger number, all right? The combination of that is going to create a lot of what's called biomass. That's available product that can be extracted into medicine. Does that pretty much capture it, Jonathan?
Yeah, that captures it. I also think with many people who are growing indoors, they measure their facilities in terms of thousands of square feet or hundreds of thousands of square feet. The facility we're purchasing in Malawi, for example, is 5,000 acres.
Yeah, right, exactly right. So on a square footage basis, it's got many, many zeros.
I don't even know how many square feet.
I don't either. And we're not going to figure that out. Flips, on the other hand, is running the math right now. It's unbelievable how quick he's burning through that calculator. All right, so let's talk a little bit about, you mentioned the U.S., but we're kind of concentrating on some other countries. So it's my understanding, because you were kind enough to share with me a few things before the show, that you're thinking about growing in Africa, extracting in Portugal, shipping to Canada to have it packaged into brands.
So,
okay, A, is that true? And B, where's the U.S. fit into that?
So we are growing in Africa. And we imminently will be shipping it to Portugal to be turned into very refined cannabinoids. And from there, we will be shipping it to a joint venture that we are setting up over here in the USA. So I think this is really one of the key bits of the story of EXM, and frankly, one of the bits I'm most excited about. And one of the other people who's standing in the back of the studio here is going to be intimately involved in this. So what we are doing in the US is we are setting up a joint venture with a 50-50 joint venture with a Canadian company called GFR Pharmaceutical. GFR Pharmaceutical is Canada's biggest white label nutraceutical company. They have a state-of-the-art facility about 45 minutes drive from downtown Vancouver. It's genuinely very impressive. Anybody who's interested in this, I would suggest you do go. I've been there a couple of times. It's a facility with hundreds of employees. Ingredients come in one end, and out of the other end go sort of vitamin pills, sachets, tablets, all kinds of nutraceutical products go off to very major retailers. It's mainly a white label business. They do have some brands. And the joint venture will be very much teaming up with them, 50-50. So we will look to buy, lease, or build a factory somewhere in the continental US that makes sense. And we're taking advice on this right now. And we obviously have people who've done this before. And we will look to get a facility there, which is something on an industrial scale that can produce many, many different types of products, incredibly professional. We'll obviously look to get this FDA regulated. And this is one of the things that I think it's not enough just to grow cannabis and say that it's cheap. And it's not enough just to process it and try to have a product. You've got to think about routes to market. And frankly, we would like to, as soon as we get that up and running through the factory, onboard as many brands as we can. And Tripp, I think this is something that you're going to be leading the charge on.
Well, let me ask you to hold on a second, because what people can't see is that Tripp Keber, believe it or not, hasn't said a word up to now. It's quite remarkable for those of you who know Tripp. Well, we've asked him to jump on the mic and just kind of share his thoughts. So I have a specific question for you, Tripp. So you've been on the show twice, now a third time. So you have the leading batting average in NYCBD. Congratulations. All right, with Jeffrey Hill, of course. So now you could have chosen 1,000 projects, right? You're one of the most in-demand guys in the space. You built Dixie Elixirs, then Dixie Brands, and handed it off to your very capable partner who's doing a brilliant job. All right, having said all of that, tell us why you selected this franchise as a place to invest your very valuable time.
Yeah, well, thank you, Jeff. I appreciate it. And Jonathan, I had no intentions of stealing any of your spotlight, but and I was dressed for radio today. I didn't have any idea that we'd have so many cameras. But nonetheless, you're absolutely right. And I alluded to in the first couple of shows that I had been diligently looking through literally hundreds and hundreds of opportunities. And literally, EXM came to me more than 2 years ago, specifically one of the early founders presented this to me, and the first thing I think that any American will say is, Africa? Cannabis? What?
I think I said that, didn't I?
Yeah, I think you did.
I did.
But the reality is, as I got to understand the business plan a little bit more, and then equally as important as you alluded to, the management team, I really started to embrace this. And several months ago, I tied my little boat to the ship that is EXM, and I'm incredibly excited, first and foremost, because of the low-cost provider option, the opportunity to toll process specifically in Lisbon, which is a deal changer for the company. This will happen in the next couple of weeks. And then lastly, if not most important, is the opportunity to wholesale support brands across the globe, specifically CPG brands in the United States. Certainly you're an expert at that. We've talked about that. All of those, well, the three legs of the stool create a perfect opportunity for an investor that is interested in investing in a business that is full spectrum hemp oil, CBD outside of the United States, whether it be Canada, North America, or certainly the EU, as Jonathan alluded to early on.
Great. Okay, so a couple things. First of all, I've seen Tripp's boat. It's not so little. So for those of you who are kind of a little concerned, his boat is bigger than you might think. All right, that's number one. Number two, let's talk a little bit about what the whole philosophy of the show is, just for a second, then we're going to get back to Jonathan, right? So we've had Tripp on twice, right? Tripp is one of the pioneers in the space. He invented a brand that has become a very, very important brand and very well known, right? Okay, so we were recently at a meeting with 50 or 60 of the most important private family offices considering or currently in the space. And of course, you know, Tripp was one of the personalities that was there, along with many, many other folks. Kevin McGovern was there. The Ansons were there. Specifically, Ryan Anson was there. All right. And a number of other folks who have come on the show. The whole idea, ladies and gentlemen, is to try to bring you the best of the best and give you perspective on what the best are doing. right? So as the show continues, hopefully these folks will become friends of the show like Tripp is, and he'll bring us his ideas and his folks like Jonathan, and we'll be able to bring that thinking to you. All right, so let's go back to Jonathan if we can. Jonathan, in the comments that you made earlier about Africa and Portugal, and I understood Canada, explain a little bit more about where you see the U.S. engaging or how you're going to engage the U.S., please.
Well, I think the main way we're going to engage in the U.S. is through the joint venture that we're starting with GFR Pharma. But I think if we were just focusing on the U.S., I think that would be a mistake. So the U.S. is light years ahead of where Europe is for cannabis generally, but particularly for CBD in terms of brand penetration. When we were at this event yesterday that you were just referring to, Jeffrey,
yes,
one of the panelists said that they estimated that in California there was something like 18,000 different cannabis brands of various types that were available to consumers correct. In some part of the country. They then went through some examples of some other U.S. states. I think it was Illinois and Massachusetts where the numbers were very low, and I think in Massachusetts it was almost single figures. I think in Europe, it's a massive opportunity either for ingredients or brands for CBD generally. Everybody is excited about it. You have 700 million people. It slightly depends on how you count Greater Europe, but it's approximately twice the size of the population of the US. And I would say branding over there in terms of customer delivery mechanisms for CBD is completely in its infancy.
Right, I understand that. One thing that he mentioned, ladies and gentlemen, that I found fascinating, that the U.S. is ahead of anybody in cannabis, right? Because as you all know, it was December of last year, December of 2018, where the Farm Bill was passed by the president, which kind of opened the door to CBD in this country, right? Now, if we're ahead of Europe, that suggests that Europe is quite far behind. Indeed, in the rest of the world, we are the ones that are furthest behind, which you've heard constantly on this show, right? A couple of weeks ago, we had Dr. Hinanit Koltai on from the Vulcany Institute in Israel. They've been studying the space since 1991, which makes us only 28 years behind the Israelis. All right, let's move on. You have recently been doing a road show, as you mentioned, with your old friend who is now yet again part of the show, Tripp on 3 times. I think that we're going to change the name of the show to NYCBD with Tripp and Jeff. All right. Okay. So, what has been the early reception of a firm doing the business in Africa? We heard what Tripp said. Tripp said Africa, and Portugal is quickly on the heels of that. All right. So help us understand. You've been doing a road show together. What are people saying about Africa, Portugal, and business areas or geographies that I think U.S. money and investors are not all that used to doing business in?
Very briefly, I would say everybody in the U.S.
Thank you.
Everybody in the U.S. who's looking at investing in cannabis right now in terms of cultivation would regard it as a business which is going to become a commodity. And we would agree, and we think commodity prices will come down, and we think cannabis will become a crop, just like any other, like soybeans. And that's why we think that, and generally investors would agree that you need to be growing this somewhere very cheaply. In terms of people's awareness of Africa, I would say it's not great. Understandably, it's a long way off, and maybe a lot of people haven't done a lot of business there. Europeans would tend to have more familiarity with Africa as an investing environment, and certainly that comes through in some of our conversations in London. However, what I would say is people who've been investing in cannabis for the last 3 to 4 years, like some of the large family offices over here in New York that we've been meeting with, are very well aware of Europe as a potential opportunity, a massive unexploited opportunity for the industry.
Right, no, we would agree. In fact, we did a show about 3 weeks ago, and we talked about the 20 European countries that are leading in cannabis, and we made the case that many of those countries are far ahead of where we're at. All right, so for those of you who were confused, Jonathan is from the UK. Now, Tripp flips over there. He's going, is that what that accent is? And I say, yes, that's what that accent is. All right, very good. So could you update our listeners on what is going on in the UK specifically, right? And is EXM involved there? But kind of give us an education. You touched on it briefly, but talk to us about the UK and what's happening.
So the UK situation with cannabis is actually very simple. There was a large outcry last year with some very high-profile media situations where some unfortunately very ill children, particularly epileptics, were unable to access medical marijuana that would help them. This was given a lot of press in the papers and became a bit of a cause célèbre. As a result, the law was changed, and medical cannabis is now available for prescription in the UK. However, very, very few doctors have been prescribing it, and although it's legal, the entire situation seems to be a little bit stuck.
I understand.
Recreational remains completely illegal, and I'm not an expert on the process whereby that might change. CBD is completely legal as long as it contains less than 0.2% THC.
Right. Okay. So in this country, broadly, that number is 0.3%. I find it fascinating. We'll move on in a minute. But GW Pharma invented the variety or the strain, the genetic, right, that is Epidiolex, which is the only approved cannabis product by the FDA in the United States. And it comes from your country, right? So I find it fascinating that the U.S., the FDA in the U.S. has looked to that as the quintessential brand with all the testing that's been done in the U.K. on that product and in other countries, right? And yet the U.K. as an entity, as a broad-scale geography, hasn't necessarily bought into what one of its countries is kind of a global leader in.
According to the press, less than 100 prescriptions for that drug have been written in the UK in the last 9 months.
That's astounding. All right, let's move on. All right, so as an investor, advisor, and strategist across many industries, give us a sense for your prognosis of the global cannabis market. And you might want to break that down because you're a CBD-focused individual. Maybe we just focused on CBD.
Yeah, I certainly am not an expert on recreational numbers, but I've seen various bank research report estimates on this just for Europe. And what we're seeing in Europe is estimates for how big the CBD market in Europe gets by 2027 ranges from between 30 billion to 90 billion euros per year.
Fascinating. Okay, very good. All right, Jonathan, this has been great. I like to close every interview, and I'm going to ask Tripp to do this as well. Is there anything else you'd like to say? You've kind of got an open mic. There's an audience listening to you. Your thoughts, please.
I'll jump in there. I think education is key here. There remains massive confusion over the rules as to what you can do with cannabis, with CBD, in various geographies, and this is compounded because the rules are evolving and changing, and staying on top of it takes a lot of work. So, look, I think a lot of people, shows like yours, which help to educate people and get the message out there, particularly about the trends in the industry and what's legal, I think are key. People generally get very confused about CBD. So when I talk about we're going to build a multi-billion-dollar CBD business, the next question people often ask me is, when do you think recreational cannabis will be legalized? At which point I say, I frankly don't care, because I don't need recreational cannabis to be legalized to build a multi-billion-dollar CBD industry. CBD is largely legal in many jurisdictions anyway. I think the real thing I want to get across here to people is just the huge opportunity there is in Europe. It's twice the size of the US in terms of people, and CBD is in its infancy. And honestly, I think a lot of businesses are going to turn that into something very profitable.
I would agree. Okay, so one thought for you on that, just to kind of bring some education to the audience. So we've done a study for NYCBD with Jeffrey Hill, and I launched that study. 7,000 people were involved, 1,700 CBD users, etc. Here's what we learned. It's Jonathan's point. 52% of CBD users didn't understand the difference between CBD and THC, and yet they're users. That's fascinating, right? So let's remind everybody. As Jonathan said, CBD comes from the hemp plant dominantly. We won't get into the specifics beyond that, but dominantly the hemp plant, right? The hemp plant is a subspecies of Cannabis sativa, all right, of which so is marijuana, right? Marijuana is the plant that creates psychoactive, often known as THC, right? The hemp plant produces broadly non-psychoactive products, and in order to be legal in the U.S., it must be unbalanced, 0.3% or less THC, or it will not be allowed to be marketed. Jonathan's point was 0.2%. So that notion, that clarity, I think is critically important. That's why he can develop a multi-billion-dollar business without ever touching the psychoactive part of the cannabis business. All right, now let me just go to Tripp, and then we're going to move on. Tripp, your thoughts, please, having sat in here, kind of listened to me rant and rave here. You have any thoughts that you'd like to share with the audience?
Well, it's interesting. Operating now in my 11th year in the cannabis space, certainly a majority of those focused on delivering THC to both adult use consumers and patients across the country. That's been exciting, but for the last 5.5 years, been also focusing on the delivery of full spectrum hemp oil, also known as CBD in some circles. And, what I think is most interesting, certainly with the alignment with respect to EXM, is that there is a storm brewing in the Southern Hemisphere, and it is coming from countries like Africa, potentially even South America, that is going to be disruptive to the U.S. hemp farmer. And that's both exciting and potentially awkward, but as a manufacturer and an individual that wants to build and operate and wholesale support brands, that's really important. So I think investors should take note of that. And there are great companies like EXM that are going to be able to take full advantage of that disruption. And I think at the end of the day, the end consumer, whether it be a patient or an adult use consumer focusing on health and wellness, is going to be the beneficiary of that. And I'm proud to be part of it.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that was brilliantly said, Tripp, so thank you very much. And let me underscore the point, right? It's a global marketplace we compete in. Every farmer that I talk to in upstate New York and in Western Mass, which is right near where I live, they're talking about moving to hemp, right? Why? Because you can get $35,000 an acre for hemp, and you can only get about $10,000 for, let's say, corn, tomatoes, and other things, and maybe $18,000 for tobacco in Virginia and the other major tobacco-producing states. All right, that's today. When these other countries, these global countries in global markets like Africa and South America and other countries begin to participate, it becomes a global marketplace. So for those of you who are looking hard at investing in hemp businesses in the U.S., I say just do it with your eyes open, all right? So I want to thank Jonathan Summers very much. Absolutely wonderful having you on the show.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
And we want to thank the unexpected return, number 3, of Tripp Keber, who once again has added value to the show. Thanks, Tripp.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Appreciate it.
All right, when we come back, the last segment of the show, responding to your messages, is up next. Welcome back to NYCBD with Jeffrey Hill, right here on 710 WOR Radio every Sunday at 8 a.m., also available on iHeartRadio and iTunes. We're also available on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube at NYCBD Official. Don't forget, I write a blog. Each post can be read in under 3 minutes, and like this show, the blog covers critical issues in the space. As you know, I'm up to 60 blog posts. That's been a continuing theme the last few weeks on this show because I've been a little tied up and haven't been able to do as much blogging as I would like. But stay tuned to that blog post, everyone, because there's going to be a lot more there. My blog is medium.com/@JeffreyHill2. That's medium.com/@JeffreyHill2. All right, let's move on to our fourth segment, responding to your messages. These are the best messages handpicked by the Flips and myself.
Hopefully they're good.
I'm sure they're good. The first one comes to us from Richard in Massachusetts. There is a bill in front of the governor right now suggesting CBD in Massachusetts will only be legal if it is grown, extracted, and packaged in the state. Oh, my God. That's quite astounding. And he asked me, what are your thoughts on that, Jeff? Well, Richard, this category is heading to a 50-state business. 50 separate marketplaces. There's a good chance each state will try to protect its economy, farmers, and financials and keep the business in the state, within state lines. As far as commerce is concerned, it will certainly create more opportunities for the small company since this direction limits the national leverage of the big players. But I guess we'll have to wait and see because all the big players, obviously, they want to be doing business in multiple states, and they don't want to have to buy and develop grows in every state. They simply like to ship their business across state line, which on a federal level is indeed legal. But what the government said was it is up to the states to make their laws at the state level, and that's one of them. All right, on to our next DM. This one comes from Sean, California. Even though we're mostly the tri-state plus Massachusetts.
He must be listening to the podcast.
I'm sure he is. I'm considering an investment in genetics and cultivation. What do you think, Jeff? Well, Sean, let me say that it is not an original idea. The space was built on those two segments of the supply chain, and it's going to become increasingly commoditized. Like most CPG, which stands for consumer packaged goods, and healthcare categories, cannabis will likely follow the classic model where brands become 50% of the supply chain profitability and the other 50% is fought for by other players in the supply chain. Well, who are they in this case? Well, that's genetics where I think there is real long-term IP. Cultivation, interesting, very likely to be commoditized. Extraction, some significant IP there, but increasingly commoditized. Manufacturing, we all know that one. And then retail. All right, so those are the other component parts. Retail always does well. Why? Because they mark everything up, what my dad used to call a keystone. Double the price, 50% margin. So they're covered. All right. However, all the other players, it's an interesting go. So if I were you, I would be listening, Sean, to the show and start thinking about investing in some of the things that we believe are a little bit more proactive, kind of what Tripp used to say, where the puck is going, not where the puck is now. By the way, Gretzky said that, maybe 1,000 other people, but we'll give Tripp credit anyway. All right, our last letter comes from Susan in New Jersey. There is CBD and cannabis available all over this state. I am worried about the health reports I have read, but have successfully taken the product for anxiety and am now worried about what I should do. I think she's talking about the vaping issues, right? Well, Susan, like any emerging and rapidly growing category, there are pretenders and corner cutters. In healthcare, that's never good. Do your homework, I say, Susan. Make sure the product you are taking is from a reputable source and has a third-party testing document that you can see. For perspective, all reputable brands in the space have test results via either QR code readers on the package or on their website. Or call the company and ask them for the third-party tests and convince yourself that you're doing the right thing. Remember, it's 2019, and many consumers are taking charge of their own health care in partnership with their doctors. So you, the consumer, must be aware and thorough in making your selections, right? Caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. All right, well, I hope you enjoyed today's show and our guest, Jonathan Summers of EXMCeuticals, and our surprise guest, Tripp Keber of NYCBD with Jeffrey Hill and Tripp. We'll be back next week for another 60 minutes of the critical issues facing cannabis and CBD, the medical issues, the political implications, and the financial implications. Remember, knowledge is built brick by brick. Today you got my 19th brick. Until next week, this is NYCBD with Jeffrey Hill.